Gavril Ilyich Myasnikov was born on February 25, 1889, in Chistopol in the Ural Mountains. Not much about his early pre-Bolshevik and pre-revolutionary life is known, but when he was a child, he left school to work at the Motovelika arms factory in Perm. Perm at this time was known for its metallurgical industry, and it was a hotbed of working-class militancy. So, it is no wonder that he would eventually become an incorrigible militant. At a young age, he would become a metalworker. And in 1905, during the Revolution, when he would have just been 16 years old, he joined the Socialist Revolutionary Party. As a young militant in the S.R.s, he helped to establish a local Soviet in Motovelika, acquired weapons, and was a member of a combat unit. But 1 year later, he would join the Bolshevik faction of the RSDLP, and soon after, he would end up getting arrested and exiled to Siberia. He would eventually escape in 1908, but would be arrested again in 1909, only to escape once more in 1911, to be arrested one last time in 1913. As his numerous prison stints would show, Myasnikov had a reputation of never bowing to authority. The intransigence and belligerence which he displayed towards the Tsarist police, he would display against his own party and the Soviet state in the future. During each of his prison stints, he fought against the guards and was constantly beaten for his insubordinance. For the 7 years that Myasnikov spent in prison, he spent over 3 months' worth of that time on hunger strikes. When Myasnikov would be released in 1917, he found employment in the factories in his home region, and soon after, the February Revolution would explode across Russia. And when it did, Myasnikov did not hesitate to re-enter political activity. Myasnikov was actively involved in the establishment of factory committees and the reconstruction of the local Soviet. He was also one of those communists that supported the destruction of the provisional government and called for the transfer of all power to the Soviets, placing him firmly on the left flank of the Bolshevik Party. As a result, Myasnikov's first brush with internal Bolshevik opposition was during the Brest-Litovsk controversy in 1918, where he sided with the left communists against Lenin. But Myasnikov's most important act in 1918 was not siding with the left communists. No, rather, on July 12th, a few days after the S.R. uprising, Myasnikov and a group of workers arrived at the apartment of Grand Duke Michael Alexandrovich, Tsar Nicholas's younger brother. They presented him with fake Cheka documents and took him into their custody. The group of vigilantes would later execute him. For this action, Myasnikov was denounced by the local party branch, but Paul Avrich and Myasnikov himself alleged that this action was actually a secret mission given to him by Lenin, not a random act of violence. Unlike some of the top Bolsheviks, Myasnikov's actions during the Civil War aren't documented. The Urals were a key battleground during the Civil War, so it's not unlikely that Myasnikov played a key role in the fighting, but no definitive information is given. By 1920, when Myasnikov does reemerge, the party was going through a great crisis. Although the communists were winning the war, the nation was in ruin, and arguments on the direction of the revolution inside and outside of Russia were splitting the party. It was during the course of these party debates that Myasnikov explodes onto the scene with his characteristic belligerence. During this time, Myasnikov was the head of the propaganda department of the Perm branch of the party, and also a member of the local party committee. In March of 1920, the 9th Congress of the party took place. 10 years later, looking back, Myasnikov would argue that it was during and after this Congress that the revolution would begin to degenerate, specifically that it led to and produced a petty bourgeois coup d'etat. It was also after the 9th Congress that Shlapnikov and the metal worker union members would ramp up their opposition to the Bolshevik Party's direction, and later form the Workers' Opposition, writing their theses in December 1920. In the same month, Myasnikov would write an essay titled The Same, Only in a Different Way, where he criticized some of the views of his comrades on the role of trade unions. Although Myasnikov shared some of the criticisms of the Bolshevik Party that the Workers' Opposition did, Myasnikov was not a member of this group, nor did he share a kinship with them. This was specifically because he disagreed with their view of a union-managed economy. Myasnikov did not support any of the major platforms during the trade union controversy. In fact, he considered trade unions to be useless, and believed that they only still existed in Russia due to the fact that their dissolution would cause complaints from foreign socialists. Rather than the unions, Myasnikov believed that the workers should manage the state and the economy through the Soviets, like most other left communists. Thus, he did not associate with the Workers' Opposition at all in 1920 and 1921, although he was accused of being an active member. He did, however, sign the Appeal of the 22 in 1922. But this again was not because he supported the political views of the Workers' Opposition, but because of his own unique and peculiar political views that differentiate himself from a majority of the other Bolsheviks. Myasnikov was a free speech absolutist. He believed in freedom of the press for all of the workers, as well as for opponents of the regime, meaning that even liberals, anarchists, and monarchists would be allowed free speech in Myasnikov's world. Myasnikov argued that it did not matter if the reactionaries were allowed to spew falsities against the regime, because he believed that the workers would not be deceived by such slander. And so, for the Soviet Republic to be a truly free state, they must allow free speech for everyone. In the future, however, Myasnikov would narrow his view of freedom of the press to exclude reactionaries. In response to his consistent advocacy of free speech, Lenin attempted to convince Myasnikov of the error of his ways. On August 1st, 1921, Lenin wrote to him, "Comrade Myasnikov, I read your article which Bukharin passed on to me, only today, and very cursorily. I should like to have a talk with you. I hope to be in Moscow one of these days and find time for a half-hour talk with you. The beginning of your article is good and businesslike, but there are some obvious errors in your conclusions. Perhaps there is some misunderstanding. It looks as if you have failed to say in the article what you have told N.I. Bukharin. What sort of freedom of the press do you want? Under the law? For workers too? SRs and Mensheviks? Just now? The article does not make it clear. Drop me a line, with communist greetings." 4 days later, Lenin writes a more direct response to the article, saying, "Freedom of the press from the monarchists to the anarchists inclusively." Very good, but just a minute. Every Marxist and every worker who ponders over the 4 years' experience of our revolution will say, let's look into this. What sort of freedom of the press? What for? For which class? We do not believe in absolutes. The freedom of the press slogan became a great world slogan at the close of the Middle Ages and remained so up to the 19th century. Why? Because it expressed the ideas of the progressive bourgeoisie, i.e., its struggle against kings and priests, feudal lords and landowners. No country in the world has done as much to liberate the masses from the influence of the priests and landowners as the RSFSR has done, and is doing. We have been performing this function of freedom of the press better than anyone else in the world. All over the world, wherever there are capitalists, freedom of the press means freedom to buy up newspapers, to buy writers, to bribe, buy, and fake public opinion for the benefit of the bourgeoisie. Freedom of press in Soviet Russia, which is encircled by bourgeois enemies of the entire world, is freedom for the political organization of the bourgeoisie and its most trusted servants, the Mensheviks and social revolutionists. This is an undeniable fact. The world bourgeoisie is so much stronger than we are. To give it such a weapon as freedom of political organizations means to make it easier for the enemy. It means to help the class enemy. Lenin wrote that he hoped that after sober reconsideration that Myasnikov would drop his advocacy of this political error and step back into line, but Myasnikov did quite the opposite. Instead, he responded to Lenin saying, "Words, words, as Hamlet said. You yourself realize that all that is not serious. It is strongly worded, but far from convincing. You say that I want freedom of the press for the bourgeoisie. On the contrary, I want freedom of press for myself, a proletarian who never had anything, a proletarian who has been in the party for 15 years, who has been a party member in Russia and not abroad. I spent 7.5 of the 11 years of my party membership before 1917 in prisons and at hard labor, with a total of 75 days in hunger strikes. I was mercilessly beaten and subjected to other tortures. I had to hobo my way back, and I escaped not abroad, but for party work here in Russia. To me, one can grant at least a little freedom of the press, at least within the party. Or is it that I must leave or be expelled from the party as soon as I disagree with you in the evaluation of social forces? Such simplified treatment evades but does not tackle our problems. To break the jaws of the international bourgeoisie is all very well, but the trouble is that you lift your hand against the bourgeoisie and you strike at the worker. Which class now supplies the greatest number of people arrested on charges of counter-revolution? Peasants and workers, to be sure. There is no communist working class. There is just a working class, pure and simple. Don't you know that thousands of proletarians are kept in prison because they talk the way I am talking now? And that bourgeois people are not arrested on this score for the simple reason that they are never concerned with these questions? If I am still at large, that is so because of my standing as a communist. I suffered for my communist views. Moreover, I am known by the workers. Were it not for these facts, were I just an ordinary communist mechanic from the same factory, where would I be now? In the Cheka? Or more than this, I would be made to escape. Just as I made Mikhail Romanov escape. As Luxembourg and Liebknecht were made to escape. Once more I say to you, you raise your hand against the bourgeoisie, but it is I who am spitting blood, and it is we, the workers, whose jaws are being cracked. Quite the opposite of most other oppositionists, Myasnikov was genuinely a dissident, both in the fact that he didn't shut up when Lenin said so, and also because he did not keep his qualms contained within the party apparatus. Like a true underground Bolshevik, he went straight to the factory, and straight to the workers. But because of this, and because of his refusal to reverse his stance on the position of freedom of speech in the press, he was summoned to Petrograd in early 1921 so that he could be watched and kept on a leash. But at the same time that Myasnikov came to Petrograd, strikes had been rocking the city. It was while in Petrograd, the capital of the revolution, that Myasnikov, like Shliapnikov had 2 years prior, noticed that something was quite wrong. He would write in a letter to the Central Committee, "When I came to Petrograd, the city was in a festive mood. All the papers rejoiced that the sleeper was awakening, that Petrograd industry was beginning to breathe freely, etc. But this was only in Potemkin villages. Upon closer examination, I began to see that, to my great amazement, all was not well in Petrograd. Mills and factories were frequently on strike, the communist influence was lacking, and the workers had no sense of participation in the government. It seemed far away and not their own. In order to get something from it, they had to exert pressure. Without pressure, nothing could be gotten. The government threw the blame for the frequent strikes, the Italian strikes, upon the Bolsheviks and the social revolutionists, those pernicious agitators who were being arrested in order to save us from their seditious propaganda. But despite repressions, strikes did not stop." He believed that the party by this point had become infested with careerists, and that they cared only for their own position within the party hierarchy. Myasnikov had it out for the top leadership of the party, but particularly Zinoviev, who dominated the Petrograd party organization. He and his cadre lived a high lifestyle. They lived lavishly, drinking and partying in a hotel, while the workers in the city were going hungry. In response to Myasnikov's attacks on him, Zinoviev declared that he was either a sick man or a socialist revolutionary, and threatened to have him expelled from the party. In March, the Kronstadt rebellion occurred. It was quickly suppressed by the Bolshevik party. Myasnikov was the only one who refused to denounce the revolt as counter-revolutionary. Although the original plan of bringing Myasnikov to Petrograd was to control him, they found that they couldn't get him to shut the fuck up, so they sent him back to the Urals, hoping he would be less trouble away from the capital. But this once again backfired, because once he was back in his home area, he immediately began stirring up trouble. He managed to win a following in the local party organization with his criticisms of the Central Party leadership. In July, he wrote a pamphlet, Botnie Voprosi, Vexed Questions, which was eventually passed on to Lenin by Bukharin. It was this pamphlet that prompted the August correspondence between Lenin and Myasnikov. It was only a few weeks after that correspondence had ended that Myasnikov had decided to, quite defiantly, organize a faction within the party, despite the fact that factions had been banned since March following the Kronstadt revolt. He would form the Workers' Group of the Russian Communist Party. Myasnikov would stage a walkout of the Motovelika delegation from a party conference in Perm, and handed a note of protest to the provincial party committee. This prompted the org bureau to forbid him from sending out any more letters, and then they summoned him to Moscow to put him under watch again. But not for long. He would return to the Urals soon, and continue his activities in spite of the warnings. In November, Myasnikov would make a drastic decision. He decided to publish in pamphlet form both Lenin's August 5th letter to him, his response, and the org bureau's decision to censor him, plus the local party's resolution against it. This pamphlet wasn't meant to be an open declaration of war against the Bolshevik Party. In fact, it was intended for party members only, and just 500 copies were printed. His goal was apparently to start a discussion, rather than a fight. Regardless of intent, this would truly be the final straw. The party took its time, but Myasnikov would finally be expelled in February 1922, with the provision that if he amended his ways, he could be readmitted. But about a week after his expulsion, he would be one of the signatories in Shliapnikov's appeal of the 22, which was sent to the Comintern. The Comintern rejected this appeal, and the party sought to punish those involved. After the 11th Party Congress in spring of 1922, Myasnikov would be arrested by the GPU, being the first Bolshevik ever to be arrested by the Soviet state. He would narrowly avoid being assassinated during his arrest. When he arrived in jail, he immediately went on a hunger strike, and thus was released soon afterwards. From here, he traveled to Moscow and worked again on establishing the Workers' Group. In February 1923, the Workers' Group in Moscow wrote their manifesto before the upcoming 12th Party Congress, where they laid out their positions. Paul Avrich writes, "The emergence of the Workers' Group did not pass unnoticed. It figured prominently at the 12th Party Congress held in April 1923, which convened in the absence of Lenin, who had suffered a series of strokes that left him paralyzed and deprived of speech. On the eve of the Congress, an anonymous platform was circulated which called on all honest proletarian elements, both inside and outside the party, to unite on the basis of the manifesto of the Workers' Group. The authorship of this document, which denounced the triumvirate of Zinoviev, Kamenev, and Stalin, and demanded their removal from the Central Committee, apparently rested with the Workers' Group, and perhaps with Myasnikov himself. On May 25th, Myasnikov was arrested again by the GPU and interrogated. Shortly after, however, he was released and permitted to travel to Germany on a trade mission. While in Germany, he made connections with the left communist KPD and the left wing of the KPD, led by Fischer and Maslov. In his absence, The workers' group, which had grown to at least 300 members, was suppressed following the rise in unrest by the workers in the fall of 1923. The workers' group was declared to be anti-communist and anti-Soviet. Its offices were raided, members arrested, and literature seized, with some of the group's members being expelled from the Bolshevik Party and others only given reprimands. Although Myasnikov himself wasn't involved, he was still deemed dangerous. In the fall, he was lured back to Russia with the assurance that he wouldn't be arrested. But the moment he arrived, that is exactly what happened, with Dzerzhinsky himself carrying out the arrest. For the next 3 years, Myasnikov languished in prison. He continued his protests, but they only resulted in him being placed in an insane asylum and the exile of his wife and 3 sons. In 1927, Myasnikov was banished to Yerevan in the Armenian SSR, where he was kept under government surveillance. On the 11th anniversary of the October Revolution, he participated in an anti-government demonstration. Fearing that he might be arrested for this, he chose to escape the country with a collection of his written documents. He attempted to enter into Iran, where he was immediately arrested. While under arrest, many of his works were turned over to the Soviets, and what little he managed to keep were stolen in a KGB raid. The lost documents included Concerning Classes in Contemporary Russia, a brief critique of the theory and practice of the All-Union Communist Party Bolsheviks in the Comintern, the class theory of the state of the U.S.S.R, liquidationism and Marxism, victories and defeats of the Russian proletariat, or Who Betrayed October, as well as an autobiography and an entire book explaining why he killed the Tsar's brother. After some time, he was deported from Iran to Turkey, where he was constantly harassed by the police. While in Turkey, he met with and began to correspond with Trotsky, who had himself recently been exiled there. Trotsky was Myasnikov's principal enemy some 7 years ago, and the chief crusher of all opposition prior to 1924. So even though they are now both exiles, neither of them held much love for the other. Even though they shared some views, on important issues they couldn't be reconciled. For one, Myasnikov believed that the U.S.S.R. ceased to be a worker state, a view which Trotsky held till he died. When Myasnikov asked Trotsky to write a preface to his article on the topic, titled The Latest Deception, Trotsky refused. One thing which they did have in common was the belief that a new international was needed, with Trotsky creating his 4th international years later, and Myasnikov writing a draft platform for the establishment of a Communist Worker International, not to be confused with the KAPD's Communist Worker International. His time with Trotsky was quite limited, and because of their irreconcilable differences, they ceased discussing politics altogether. He asked Trotsky for financial assistance and help getting a visa. He received a measly amount of money from him, around $25, but no help with a visa. Myasnikov had only managed to leave Turkey with the help of German communists and particularly the philosopher and left communist Karl Korsch, as well as the French trade unionist Louis Sellier, who managed to get him a visa to live in France. From there, Myasnikov settled down in Paris, where he found work as a metalworker, his lifelong trade. He also began to associate with anarcho-syndicalists and joined the CGTU. However, he still maintained contacts with the communist movement and never considered himself to be an anarchist or a syndicalist, still defending the concept of a worker state. He simply wished to be amongst the working class rank and file, and as a result, found himself in this proletarian organization, despite their anarchist leanings. Living in France, Myasnikov would learn the language and remarry, and after some troubles would eventually settle into his new French life. From then on, Myasnikov lived his life regularly until the Nazi invasion, where he was arrested at work for visiting the Soviet embassy, either to inquire about his children or to enlist in the Red Army. From there, he was placed under Gestapo watch, but characteristically, he eventually escaped, but only to be arrested by the French police and put into a concentration camp, which, again, he escaped from in 1943. Afterwards, he hid in Paris until the city was liberated. In 1945, agents from the Soviet Union contacted him and offered him to return on the promise that he would be able to live freely in Moscow. At first, Myasnikov refused, since they had already played this trick on him 20 years ago. But after repeated assurance that he wouldn't be arrested, Myasnikov finally agreed and took a plane to the U.S.S.R. The moment that he got off the plane, he was arrested. In January, he was interrogated, the transcript of which was documented and was translated as The Last Testament of the Left Communist Gavril Myasnikov. On November 16, 1945, at the age of 56, Myasnikov was executed by the Soviet state. During the war, all 3 of Myasnikov's sons died at the front, causing his wife to have a mental break and be sent to a hospital. At some point during his return, Soviet authorities had told his wife that her husband had finally come back to the Soviet Union and that she could see him. At first, Myasnikov's wife didn't know what to do, but when she finally decided to go and visit him, the moment she arrived, she was informed that he was killed a day before her arrival. As a result, she suffered another breakdown. and returned to the hospital where she died shortly after. Myasnikov was a lifelong rebel, and even when he was facing death, he still remained a hardhead, adamant in his beliefs, never changing, truly an intransigent. He maintained a great faith in the power of the workers, in the rule of the Soviets, and the eventual victory of the revolution, and it seems that he died holding those beliefs.